Hi, welcome to 6th grade life science, and today's standard is to obtain and communicate evidence to support the cell theory. And we are going to discuss cells and cell theory today in my 6th grade virtual science classroom. All right, so let's start off with, what is the cell theory? The cell theory is one of the most basic principles of biology. It states that all living things are composed of cells and that cells are the basic unit of life. Can you believe that once upon a time, it was believed that life just spontaneously generated, like live alligators came from rotting logs and water? Well, in some future slides, I'm going to show you two scientists who helped disprove that spontaneous generation does not actually occur. So let's go over what are the three parts to the cell theory. Number one, the cell is the most basic unit of life. Number two, all living things are made from cells. And number three, cells come from pre-existing cells. So what are cells? Cells are the most basic building blocks of all living things. And how can we see cells? Cells are teeny tiny microscopic organisms. To see cells, we need to use a scientific tool known as a microscope. I'm holding a microscope here, and you can see the very first microscope over here on the left, created by Galileo Galilei in 1609. And then I have two pictures here, one of an animal cell and one of a plant cell. They have very similar structures, but they also have a few differences as well. We'll get into those in a future lesson. All right, so here's a really cool picture of a cells that have been seen under a microscope. And in the 1950s, scientists developed more powerful microscopes, light microscopes, which send a beam of light through a specimen or an object you are studying. There's even more powerful microscopes called electron microscopes, and that passes a beam of electrons through a specimen. Sending electrons through the cells allows us to see its smallest parts, even the parts inside of the cell. Without electron microscopes, we would not know what the inside of the cell looks like. And we're going to get into what the inside of cells looks like in a future lesson. So we'll be coming back to this as well. All right, so let's talk about this spontaneous generation I mentioned earlier about alligators coming from rotting logs in the water, which you and I both know is a pretty silly thought process. But before the known cell theory, people believed in spontaneous generation, which means that living things could come from non-living things. And these two scientists worked to disprove spontaneous generation, and they did this almost 200 years apart from one another, Louis Pasteur and Francesco Redi. So here are their experiments, and the first scientist we're going to discuss is Francesco. He was a scientist who did this almost 200 years before Louis Pasteur, and what he did with his experiment is people believed that maggots just came from rotting meat, when in fact there was a source that caused those maggots to come, and that source is flies. So he set up an experiment where he sat meat in an unsealed flask, a sealed flask, and then a flask that was covered with gauze. So in the unsealed flask, outside organisms had access to the meat. So for example, flies, they were able to land on the meat, and that meat generated the maggots. In the sealed flask, no outside sources, not even air, could get to the meat, and no maggots were formed. And in the flask covered with gauze, there could be some air that could get to the meat, but living organisms like the flies or other things in the atmosphere couldn't get to the meat, but air could still get to the meat. And that meat did not create maggots either. So the maggots had to have come from the source, which were the flies. Now, 200 years later, Louis Pasteur tried to recreate a very similar experiment to Redi's experiment. And what he did with his experiment is he boiled a broth and let it get really hot to kill any organisms that could have been living inside the broth. Then he used a special flask, and at the top he kind of melted and created this top to his flask. And this still allowed for some air to pass through that could get to the broth, but any little living organisms in the atmosphere got caught in the tube. So the living organisms couldn't make it to the broth, but the air could make it to the broth. He let this sit in his lab for over a year, and there was absolutely no growth. There were no organisms that grew or were visible inside of the flask. After a year, and maybe even a tad longer than a year, he broke the top of the flask. And when he broke the top of the flask, now not only could air get to the broth, but so could any other living organisms in the air, whereas in the beginning they got caught and trapped in this tube. But here there was nothing to trap them, and they were able to get access to that broth, and that broth provided them with nutrients, and they were able to thrive and grow. And the growth happened in less than 3 days from him breaking the flask, which just continued to prove that spontaneous generation can't possibly happen. Life has to come from other living things. So here is an example of cells coming from cells, and that was part of our cell theory. All cells come from pre-existing cells, and this process is known as cell division. And there are 2 types of cell division: mitosis, which occurs in somatic cells, and meiosis, which occurs in reproductive cells. So let's talk about the difference between somatic cells and reproductive cells. Somatic cells make up all of the regular cells in a living organism, plant or animal. And let's talk about humans, because you and I are super familiar with humans since we are a human. So our bodies are full of somatic cells. Our skin cells, our cardiac cells, our muscular cells, the cells that line our stomachs and our intestines and all of our organs, our blood cells, all the cells in our body are somatic cells except one special cell, and that's our reproductive cells. And so in girls, those are your eggs, and in boys, that would be the sperm cells. So those are the only cells in the human body that go through cell division called meiosis, but all the other cells go through the process called mitosis. So let's talk about mitosis, which is what is depicted down here. So every cell in our body performs its job, and different cells' jobs take more time or less time than other cells. But all cells are created from pre-existing cells. And let's just say this is a skin cell. So my parent cell here is a skin cell, and it has functioned and it has performed its task as a skin cell. And now it's going to undergo the process of mitosis. So in mitosis, the first thing that happens is the DNA, and in this picture it is the red and the blue. The DNA makes a copy of itself, and it's called DNA replication. And then after DNA replication takes place, it begins the steps of mitosis. And you can see here, this is where the cell is beginning to pull and separate. And it's going to get bigger, and you can already see where there's going to be a cell form here and a cell that's going to form here. And these parts of the DNA are going to separate, and we're going to create 2 daughter cells that are identical to the original parent cell. So we no longer have this parent cell because this parent cell divided and turned into 2 daughter cells. So that is the process of mitosis, and that is cell division. And that shows us that all cells have to come from pre-existing cells. All right, so let's review the 3 parts to the cell theory. Number 1, the cell is the basic unit of life. Number 2, all living things are made from cells. And number 3, cells come from pre-existing cells.